The fastest way to discover the richest person in the room is to watch who still stands with dignity after everyone else decides they are not worth respecting. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across the grand ballroom of the Sterling Tower in downtown Chicago, where nearly 500 guests dressed in custom tuxedos and designer gowns gathered to celebrate one of the city's most anticipated engagement parties. Waiters moved gracefully between polished marble columns carrying silver trays filled with sparkling cider and gourmet appetizers, while a string quartet performed quietly beneath the towering glass ceiling. Every conversation revolved around one name: Evelyn Sterling, billionaire, visionary, founder and chief executive officer of Sterling Global Holdings. Her reputation had been built on discipline, precision, and impossible standards. Investors admired her. Business magazines celebrated her. Employees feared disappointing her. Tonight, however, none of those accomplishments mattered as much as the announcement everyone expected her to make about her only daughter. Charlotte Sterling stood near the center of the ballroom, wearing an elegant ivory evening dress, her gentle smile revealing both excitement and nervous anticipation. Beside her stood Daniel Brooks, a 40-year-old single father whose tailored suit had clearly been altered more than once to fit properly. It was clean, carefully pressed, and several years old, but Daniel wore it with quiet confidence instead of embarrassment. Standing proudly beside him was his 9-year-old son, Owen, wearing a small navy blazer and holding tightly onto his father's hand while looking around the magnificent ballroom with innocent curiosity. Daniel leaned down and smiled warmly. "You doing all right, buddy?" Owen nodded with bright eyes. "This place looks like a castle." Daniel chuckled softly. "People can build beautiful buildings. The harder part is building a beautiful heart." Owen smiled as though his father had just shared the greatest secret in the world. Across the ballroom, whispers drifted from one table to another. Some guests recognized Daniel as nothing more than a neighborhood auto mechanic. Others quietly wondered how an ordinary single father had somehow won the heart of the daughter of one of America's most powerful businesswomen. Several executives exchanged polite smiles that barely concealed their disbelief. Charlotte noticed every glance, yet she never loosened her grip on Daniel's hand. She had already chosen the life she wanted. At precisely 7 o'clock, the orchestra fell silent. Every conversation stopped as Evelyn Sterling stepped onto the illuminated stage wearing a perfectly tailored black evening gown that reflected the same confidence she displayed in every corporate boardroom she entered. She accepted the microphone without hesitation. "Thank you for celebrating with our family this evening," she began, her calm voice filling the ballroom effortlessly. Guests responded with warm applause. Evelyn smiled graciously before turning toward Charlotte. "My daughter has always surprised me." More laughter followed. Then her expression slowly changed. "Unfortunately, tonight is another surprise." Charlotte's smile faded. Daniel quietly squeezed her hand, but said nothing. Evelyn looked directly at him for the first time all evening. "I built everything our family owns through sacrifice, discipline, and standards that never accepted excuses. I refuse to watch my daughter throw away her future by marrying a man who cannot offer her the life she deserves." A heavy silence settled across the ballroom. No glasses moved. No chairs shifted. Owen looked up at his father, confused by words he did not fully understand. Charlotte stepped forward, her voice trembling but steady. "Mother, I love him," Evelyn answered without raising her voice. "Then from this moment forward, you are no longer my daughter." Gasps quietly spread through the crowd. Cameras lowered. Even the musicians forgot to move. Hundreds of eyes turned toward Daniel, expecting anger, humiliation, or desperate pleading. Instead, he gently placed one reassuring hand on Owen's shoulder, looked at Charlotte with unwavering kindness, and spoke only 6 quiet words. Love never asks permission for pride. No one in the ballroom realized that before this story reached its end, those same words would become the reason an entire room stood speechless. Nobody left the ballroom immediately. Wealth had taught many of the guests how to recover gracefully from uncomfortable moments, but this silence refused to cooperate. Crystal glasses remained untouched. Conversations dissolved into uncertain whispers. The orchestra quietly lowered their instruments, unsure whether the evening had ended or merely changed forever. Charlotte Sterling stood motionless for several long seconds before slowly turning toward Daniel. Her eyes shimmered with disappointment, not because of the inheritance she had just lost, but because the woman who had taught her to pursue excellence had mistaken wealth for worth. Daniel reached for her hand with the same calm confidence he had carried throughout the evening. "We should go," he said softly. Charlotte nodded. She looked once toward the stage, hoping her mother might reconsider. Evelyn Sterling never moved. Her posture remained perfectly straight, her expression carefully controlled, as though every emotion had already been replaced by discipline. Daniel gently looked down at Owen. "Ready to head home, buddy?" The little boy glanced around the enormous ballroom before asking in an innocent voice, "Did we do something wrong?" Daniel knelt beside him, so they were eye level. "No, son. Sometimes people need time before they can see someone clearly." Owen accepted the answer without another question. He simply reached for his father's hand again. Together, the three of them walked toward the grand entrance beneath hundreds of silent eyes. Nobody stopped them. Nobody applauded. Yet something unexpected happened as they reached the doors. An elderly waiter quietly stepped forward and opened the heavy glass door before Daniel could reach for it. He smiled warmly and whispered, "I hope your family has a peaceful evening." Daniel smiled back. "Thank you. Kindness always finds its way home." The waiter nodded respectfully. It was a tiny exchange, almost invisible among so much luxury, but several nearby guests noticed it. They watched a man with very little receive genuine respect without asking for it. Outside, the cool Chicago evening welcomed them with crisp autumn air. The city skyline sparkled against the darkening sky, while expensive luxury cars lined the valet entrance. Daniel walked past every limousine until he reached his aging pickup truck parked near the edge of the lot. The paint had faded after years of honest work, and the engine had accumulated more than 200,000 miles. Yet he opened the passenger door for Charlotte before helping Owen climb into the back seat. As the truck pulled quietly onto the street, the magnificent Sterling Tower gradually disappeared in the rearview mirror. No one spoke for several blocks. The only sound came from the steady hum of the engine and the gentle rhythm of tires crossing familiar pavement. Finally, Charlotte broke the silence. "I'm sorry you had to experience that because of me." Daniel kept his eyes on the road. "Do not apologize for choosing love." She looked toward him. "You lost your dignity tonight because of my family." Daniel smiled faintly. "Dignity is not something another person can take away. We surrender it only when we stop treating people with respect." Charlotte lowered her eyes. Those words stayed with her far longer than her mother's rejection. When they reached Daniel's modest home on a quiet suburban street, warm porch lights welcomed them instead of photographers. Owen ran inside, happily placing his tiny dress shoes beside the front door before changing into comfortable socks. Daniel prepared grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, while Charlotte quietly set the small kitchen table. The meal cost less than one appetizer served at the ballroom only an hour earlier, yet laughter slowly returned to the room. Owen proudly showed Charlotte a drawing he had made at school, and Daniel listened with complete attention as though nothing else in the world mattered. Far across the city, Evelyn Sterling stood alone inside her penthouse office overlooking thousands of glowing lights. She believed she had protected her daughter's future. She did not realize she had just pushed away the only man in the room whose character could never be measured by the balance in a bank account. 3 weeks passed, and the headlines moved on to news stories, but Evelyn Sterling never forgot the image of her daughter walking away without looking back. Every morning, she arrived at Sterling Global Holdings before sunrise, stepping into the top floor of the glass tower, where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Chicago skyline. Board meetings began precisely on schedule. Quarterly reports exceeded expectations. Investors applauded another record-breaking quarter. Every measurable sign of success surrounded her, yet an unfamiliar silence lingered inside the executive office once the conference room emptied. The framed family photograph that had once occupied the corner of her desk had quietly disappeared into a drawer. No one dared ask why. Across town, life followed a very different rhythm. Daniel Brooks unlocked the doors of his neighborhood auto repair garage before 7 o'clock every morning. The familiar scent of engine oil, fresh coffee, and cold autumn air greeted him as faithfully as the sunrise. Owen completed his homework at a small desk in the office after school, while Charlotte learned to answer customer phone calls, organize invoices, and greet every visitor with genuine kindness. She had grown up surrounded by assistants, chauffeurs, and executive dining rooms, yet she discovered unexpected joy carrying a toolbox across the shop floor or bringing sandwiches to mechanics during lunch. Daniel never treated her differently from anyone else. Every honest job deserves respect, he often reminded Owen. It does not matter whether your hands hold a wrench or a fountain pen. Owen repeated those words proudly at school one afternoon, making his teacher smile. Meanwhile, inside Sterling Tower, Evelyn quietly made a decision. If emotion had failed to separate Charlotte from Daniel, perhaps reality would succeed. During a private meeting, she looked across the polished conference table at her longtime chief of staff, Richard Coleman. I want every major charitable gala, corporate anniversary, and executive reception scheduled for this quarter combined into one event, she said calmly. Richard looked surprised. One event? Evelyn nodded. The largest gathering our company has ever hosted. He hesitated before asking, "May I ask why?" Evelyn folded her hands. Because some lessons must be learned in public. Richard recognized the tone immediately. She had already made up her mind. Within days, invitations reached governors, business leaders, philanthropists, university presidents, and international investors. The guest list grew longer than any previous Sterling event. Then Evelyn added one final instruction. Send a formal invitation to Charlotte Sterling and Daniel Brooks. Richard looked up again. As honored guests, Evelyn answered without emotion. As invited guests, the distinction was subtle but unmistakable. She intended for everyone in Chicago's most influential circles to witness the difference between inherited success and ordinary struggle. Across town, the elegant invitation arrived inside a cream-colored envelope embossed with the Sterling family crest. Charlotte stared at it for several moments before placing it gently on the kitchen table. "She wants us there," she whispered. Daniel finished washing dinner dishes before drying his hands on a simple kitchen towel. "Yes." Charlotte looked uncertain. "Do you think she wants to reconcile?" Daniel studied the envelope without touching it. "I think your mother always has a reason for everything she does." Owen looked up from his coloring book. "Are we going?" Daniel smiled gently. Sometimes courage means walking into a room where you already know not everyone wants you there. Charlotte reached for his hand. Outside, the last golden leaves drifted across the quiet neighborhood street as evening settled over the modest home. None of them realized that the invitation resting on the kitchen table had never been intended as an olive branch. It was the opening move in a carefully planned test that Evelyn believed would finally expose the man she still refused to understand. The evening of the Sterling Legacy Gala arrived beneath a clear Chicago sky where thousands of city lights shimmered against the glass towers downtown. Luxury sedans, chauffeured limousines, and black SUVs formed an endless line outside the historic Grand Monarch Hotel, while photographers welcomed. Governors, celebrated entrepreneurs, philanthropists, and nationally recognized business leaders. Inside, crystal chandeliers illuminated an enormous ballroom decorated with white roses, polished marble, and towering arrangements of autumn leaves that reflected warm golden light across every table. Soft piano music floated through the room as conversations blended into the quiet confidence that only wealth seemed able to produce. At precisely 6:30, an aging blue pickup truck rolled slowly into the far corner of the parking area. It looked almost invisible beside the expensive vehicle surrounding it. Daniel Brooks stepped out first, wearing the same carefully tailored charcoal suit he had worn at the engagement celebration weeks earlier. It remained simple, spotless, and perfectly pressed. Charlotte adjusted the sleeve of his jacket, before smiling gently. You still look more handsome than anyone inside. Daniel laughed softly. That is because you love me. Owen climbed down from the truck, wearing a navy blazer that had become just a little shorter since the last formal event. He straightened his tiny tie with great determination. Do I look important? Daniel knelt beside him. You have always been important. Owen grinned proudly and reached for his father's hand. As they entered the magnificent hotel lobby, several guests immediately recognized Charlotte. Warm greetings quickly turned into awkward silence when they noticed Daniel beside her. Some executives politely nodded before quietly turning away. Others exchanged subtle glances that revealed assumptions they never spoke aloud. Charlotte noticed every expression, yet Daniel remained completely at ease. He smiled at hotel employees, thanked attendants who opened doors, and greeted strangers with the same quiet respect he offered lifelong friends. Near the ballroom entrance, Evelyn Sterling welcomed distinguished guests with flawless professionalism. Every handshake reflected years of executive discipline. Every smile appeared carefully measured. When she finally saw Charlotte approaching beside Daniel and Owen, she paused almost imperceptibly before recovering her polished composure. Thank you for accepting my invitation, she said evenly. Charlotte answered with quiet kindness. We believed it was important to come. Evelyn's eyes shifted briefly toward Daniel. I hope you understand the significance of tonight's audience. Daniel nodded respectfully. Every person deserves respect, regardless of who is watching. Evelyn offered only the faintest smile before turning to greet another arriving investor. Moments later, the ballroom doors opened. Hundreds of elegantly dressed guests filled the magnificent hall beneath brilliant crystal lights. Daniel quietly guided Owen toward their assigned table near the back of the room. It was noticeably farther from the stage than where Charlotte had always been seated during previous Sterling events. Owen looked toward the front. Did they forget our seats? Charlotte forced a gentle smile, but Daniel answered first. The best view is not always the closest one. Before anyone could say another word, a distinguished elderly gentleman with silver hair entered the ballroom, surrounded by several international executives. Conversations stopped almost instantly. It was William Ashcroft, the widely respected founder of one of the nation's largest charitable foundations, a man whose influence extended far beyond business into hospitals, universities, and humanitarian organizations across the country. Instead of walking toward the reserved table beside Evelyn Sterling, he suddenly stopped. His eyes settled on Daniel. Without hesitation, he changed direction and crossed the ballroom. Every conversation faded into silence as the elderly philanthropist extended both hands toward the quiet single father. His face brightened with unmistakable gratitude. Daniel Brooks, he said warmly enough for nearby guests to hear, I have hoped for years that our paths would cross again. The room seemed to forget how to breathe as Evelyn slowly turned toward the unexpected reunion, realizing that the carefully planned evening had just begun moving in a direction she had never anticipated. William Ashcroft's warm smile never faded as he held Daniel Brooks' hand with both of his own. Around them, conversations dissolved into complete silence. Executives who had spent decades trying to earn the philanthropist's personal attention now watched him ignore reserved dignitaries in favor of the quiet single father seated near the back of the ballroom. Daniel smiled modestly. It has been a long time, Mr. Ashcroft. The elderly businessman laughed softly. Too long. I have been searching for you ever since that winter in Denver. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly. There was never any reason. William shook his head. There was every reason. Guests leaned closer without appearing obvious. Even the waitstaff slowed their movements as curiosity quietly spread through the magnificent ballroom. Evelyn Sterling remained near the stage, her composed expression beginning to crack beneath growing uncertainty. Charlotte looked at Daniel with surprise. During all the months they had shared their lives together, he had never once mentioned knowing one of the most respected philanthropists in the country. William turned toward the crowd with a gentle smile. Forgive me for interrupting the evening, but before tonight continues, there is something many of you deserve to know. Daniel quietly shook his head. Please, that is not necessary. William placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You have hidden your kindness long enough. Every eye remained fixed upon them. William spoke slowly, his voice carrying naturally across the ballroom. 8 years ago, during one of our foundation's emergency construction projects in Colorado, an equipment failure trapped several workers inside a partially collapsed service tunnel. Panic spread quickly. Everyone waited for specialists to arrive. He paused for only a heartbeat. One man did not wait. Daniel looked down with quiet discomfort. William continued. He entered anyway because he believed every minute mattered. When the workers were safely brought out, the project resumed weeks later. Our insurance company offered him a substantial financial reward for his courage. Several guests exchanged curious glances. William smiled warmly at Daniel before continuing. He declined every dollar. A soft murmur drifted across the ballroom. William's voice remained calm. Instead, he asked that the money be redirected to the families of the injured workers and to scholarships for their children. No one spoke. Charlotte slowly covered her mouth with one hand, realizing she had never heard this story before. Owen looked proudly toward his father without fully understanding why so many adults suddenly seemed emotional. Daniel quietly interrupted. Many people helped that day. William nodded. Yes, but only one refused recognition. The elderly philanthropist reached inside his jacket and removed a carefully folded photograph. It showed a much younger Daniel standing beside several construction workers wearing dusty safety helmets, smiling with quiet humility. William handed the photograph to Charlotte. I have kept this in my office ever since. Charlotte studied the worn picture with tears gathering in her eyes. Across the ballroom, several influential business leaders recognized the image immediately. One executive whispered, I remember that project. Another quietly added, those scholarships are still funding college students today. Evelyn listened without moving. For years, she had measured success through balance sheets, acquisitions, and market value. Yet in the center of her own ballroom stood a man whose greatest achievement had never appeared on any financial statement because he had deliberately refused the reward that could have changed his own life. William gently looked toward Evelyn before speaking once more. Mr. Brooks taught me something I have never forgotten. Real wealth begins the moment a person discovers that another family's future matters as much as their own. The ballroom remained perfectly still. The applause everyone expected never came. It was replaced by something far more powerful. An entire room filled with accomplished people stood in thoughtful silence, while Evelyn Sterling slowly realized that the poorest man she believed she had invited to embarrass had quietly become the richest soul in the building. No one reached for a glass. No one checked a telephone. The silence inside the Grand Monarch Hotel had become heavier than the music that had filled the ballroom only minutes earlier. William Ashcroft slowly returned the faded photograph to the inside pocket of his jacket before looking once more at Daniel Brooks with unmistakable admiration. There is one part of the story I have never shared publicly, he said quietly. Daniel smiled with gentle discomfort. Mr. Ashcroft, tonight is about your foundation. William shook his head. No, tonight became about truth the moment I saw you walk through those doors. Hundreds of guests remained completely still. Even the photographers lowered their cameras, sensing that the next few moments carried more value than any staged image. William continued with calm sincerity. After Daniel refused the financial reward, I asked him what I could possibly do to repay him. He paused, allowing the memory to settle. He looked at me and said, if you ever meet someone who is struggling alone with a child, help them before you help me. Several people quietly lowered their eyes. Charlotte reached for Daniel's hand beneath the table, realizing that the man she loved had carried extraordinary compassion without ever mentioning it. Owen looked up proudly at his father. You really said that? Daniel smiled. It seemed like the right thing to say. William nodded warmly. Because of those words, our foundation created the Single Parent Opportunity Initiative. Over the past 8 years, it has helped thousands of mothers and fathers across the country find housing, childcare, job training, and scholarships for their children. A quiet wave of surprise moved through the ballroom. One governor exchanged stunned glances with a university president. A hospital director whispered something to the executive beside her. The program had become nationally respected, yet almost no one had ever known the quiet mechanic whose simple sentence had inspired it. Evelyn Sterling stood motionless near the stage. Her breathing slowed as memories she had ignored for years quietly returned. She remembered teaching Charlotte that leadership meant leaving every room stronger than she found it. Somewhere along the way, she had confused influence with importance. She had evaluated Daniel's suit before she had ever listened to his heart. William turned gently toward Evelyn. There was no accusation in his expression, only kindness. "Miss Sterling, your daughter chose a remarkable man." Evelyn tried to answer, but no words came. The confidence that had guided billion-dollar negotiations suddenly felt meaningless. She looked across the ballroom at Charlotte, then at Owen, laughing softly as Daniel adjusted the little boy's crooked tie. It was such a small gesture that most people would never notice it, yet it carried more tenderness than every polished speech delivered that evening. Richard Coleman quietly stepped beside Evelyn. "The opening presentation is ready whenever you are." She stared at the stage without moving. Not yet. For the first time in decades, she was no longer thinking about quarterly earnings, shareholder confidence, or media coverage. She was thinking about a family dinner she had refused to attend, a grandson she had never truly met, and a man she had judged after only one glance. Daniel slowly stood. "Mr. Ashcroft, thank you for your kindness, but I hope everyone remembers that many people have done far greater things than I ever have." William smiled gently. "Perhaps, but very few have spent so much effort making certain no one noticed." Once again, the ballroom fell into complete silence. It was not admiration for fame or wealth that held the room together. It was the realization that genuine greatness often arrives quietly, wearing an ordinary suit, holding the hand of a little boy, and asking for nothing except the chance to love his family with dignity. As Evelyn looked at Daniel across the glowing ballroom, she felt something unfamiliar begin to replace certainty. It was not defeat. It was the painful beginning of understanding, and she realized the greatest mistake of her life had never been a failed investment. It had been believing that a person's value could ever be measured by the size of a bank account. The applause finally came, but it arrived slowly, almost reluctantly, as though no one wanted to interrupt the quiet truth that had settled over the ballroom. It began with a single pair of hands near the back of the room, then another, until hundreds of guests stood, together in genuine respect. Daniel Brooks did not smile with pride. Instead, he looked almost embarrassed by the attention. He gave a small nod of gratitude before gently encouraging everyone to return to their seats. "Please," he said softly, "there are people here tonight whose work has changed far more lives than mine." His humility only deepened the admiration surrounding him. William Ashcroft laughed warmly. "You still have the same habit of pointing the spotlight toward everyone else." Daniel answered with a quiet smile. "The spotlight has never helped anyone become a better person." Those simple words lingered in the air long after they were spoken. Evelyn Sterling remained beside the stage, watching Daniel from a distance that suddenly felt much greater than the width of the ballroom. For years, she had believed she understood how to recognize exceptional people. She had interviewed brilliant executives, negotiated with world leaders, and invested in extraordinary innovators. Yet somehow she had completely overlooked the extraordinary man standing only a few yards away because his success could not be displayed on a financial report. Charlotte quietly walked toward her mother. Neither woman spoke immediately. The silence between them carried years of expectations, disappointments, and love that had never completely disappeared. Evelyn looked at her daughter with tired eyes. "How long have you known?" Charlotte smiled gently. "Not very long." Evelyn looked surprised. "He never told you?" Charlotte slowly shook her head. Daniel believes that kindness loses something valuable the moment it becomes a story meant to impress someone. Evelyn closed her eyes for only a moment. Every assumption she had made about him now felt painfully small. Nearby, Owen wandered toward one of the elaborate floral displays decorating the ballroom. He carefully picked up a tiny white flower that had fallen onto the polished marble floor. Instead of placing it in his pocket, he carried it across the room toward an elderly housekeeper who was quietly collecting empty glasses after dinner service. "I think this belongs to you," Owen said with complete sincerity. The woman smiled, with grateful surprise. "Thank you, sweetheart." Daniel watched the exchange without interrupting. Charlotte noticed him smiling. "You taught him that?" Daniel shrugged gently. Children usually remember what they see much longer than what they hear. Evelyn witnessed the entire moment. No cameras captured it. No business magazine would ever publish it. Yet somehow that tiny gesture affected her more deeply than every speech delivered that evening. She suddenly understood that Daniel had never been teaching only his son. Without trying, he had been teaching every adult in the room. Richard Coleman quietly approached again. "The media would like to interview you before the closing presentation." Evelyn looked toward the reporters waiting near the stage. For the first time in many years, public perception no longer seemed important. "They can wait." Richard nodded respectfully and stepped away. Evelyn slowly crossed the ballroom until she stood only a few feet from Daniel. Guests instinctively fell silent once again. Charlotte looked between them with cautious hope. Daniel met Evelyn's eyes without resentment, greeting her with the same quiet respect he had offered everyone else that evening. Evelyn opened her mouth to speak, but the carefully prepared words she had rehearsed throughout her career disappeared completely. Standing before the man she had judged so harshly, she realized that genuine apologies could never be delivered like corporate speeches. They had to begin with humility, and humility was something no amount of money could ever purchase. Evelyn Sterling stood before Daniel Brooks with every eye in the ballroom resting upon her. Yet for the first time in decades, she felt no desire to command the room. The woman who had spent her career delivering flawless presentations now struggled to find even a single sentence worthy of the moment. Daniel waited patiently, his expression calm, neither expecting an apology nor demanding one. Charlotte remained beside him, gently holding Owen's hand as the little boy looked curiously between the adults without understanding the weight of the silence surrounding them. Finally, Evelyn spoke. "Daniel," she said, quietly, "I believed I knew how to recognize success." She paused, lowering her eyes for a brief moment. "Tonight, I realized I only knew how to recognize wealth." The confession drifted through the ballroom with remarkable honesty. "No cameras flashed. No reporters interrupted." Even William Ashcroft remained perfectly still, allowing the moment to belong entirely to the family standing before him. Evelyn continued, her voice softer than anyone in the business world had ever heard. "I judged your future by your paycheck. I judged your character by your profession. I judged your worth before I ever gave myself the chance to know your heart." Daniel answered gently, "We all see the world through the lessons we have learned." Evelyn slowly shook her head. "Then I spent too many years learning the wrong lessons." Charlotte felt tears gathering in her eyes. It was not because her mother had become weaker. It was because for the first time since childhood, she saw a woman willing to become honest instead of impressive. Evelyn turned toward her daughter. "Charlotte, I asked you to choose between your family and the man you loved." Her voice trembled almost imperceptibly. "Instead, you chose integrity. I should have admired that instead of fighting it." Charlotte stepped closer without speaking. Daniel quietly looked toward Owen, who continued holding the tiny white flower he had picked up from the floor. The little boy gently tugged on his father's sleeve. "Dad," Daniel smiled. "Yes, buddy." Owen looked toward Evelyn. Grandma looked sad. The simple observation reached every heart in the room. Daniel knelt beside his son. Sometimes people become sad when they discover they have hurt someone they love. Owen thought carefully before walking toward Evelyn. Without hesitation, he held out the small white flower. "You can have this." Evelyn looked down at the tiny blossom resting in the little boy's hand. Her carefully controlled composure finally gave way. She accepted the flower as though it were the most valuable gift she had ever received. "Thank you," she whispered. Owen smiled innocently. "Dad says flowers make hard days a little softer." A quiet laugh mixed gently, with emotion spread across the ballroom. Daniel had not coached his son. Owen had simply repeated the kindness he witnessed every day. Evelyn slowly lowered herself until she was eye level with the child. "May I ask you something?" Owen nodded. "Would it be all right if I try to become a better grandmother?" Owen looked toward Daniel before answering. Daniel gave only a gentle smile, leaving the choice entirely to his son. Owen wrapped his small arms around Evelyn's shoulders. "Everybody gets another chance." Several guests quietly wiped away tears. William Ashcroft smiled knowingly while Charlotte covered her mouth, overwhelmed by the quiet grace unfolding before her. Daniel watched the embrace with peaceful eyes, never seeking recognition for the forgiveness that had just entered the room. At that moment, every expensive decoration, every executive title, and every symbol of success faded into the background. The greatest victory of the evening had not been won through influence or authority. It had arrived through the gentle heart of a child who believed that second chances should always be offered before final judgments. And in that simple embrace, Evelyn Sterling understood that the family she had almost lost had already begun welcoming her home. Several weeks later, the first snow of the season drifted gently across the quiet streets of Chicago, softening rooftops, sidewalks, and the hurried pace of the city. On a peaceful Sunday afternoon, there were no crystal chandeliers, no television cameras, no executives, and no speeches waiting to be delivered. Instead, the dining room of Daniel Brooks' modest home glowed with the warm light of a simple table lamp. The kitchen carried the comforting aroma of roasted chicken, fresh bread, and homemade apple pie, while laughter floated naturally through every room. Owen carefully arranged napkins around the table with complete concentration. "Grandma likes blue," he announced proudly as he placed one beside an empty chair. Daniel smiled while carrying a bowl of mashed potatoes to the table. "Then blue it is." Charlotte quietly adjusted a small vase filled with white flowers in the center of the table. They were simple flowers from the neighborhood market, yet they reminded her of the tiny blossom Owen had offered weeks earlier. A knock sounded at the front door. Daniel opened it with the same welcoming smile he offered everyone. Evelyn Sterling stood outside wearing a warm wool coat instead of an expensive designer gown. In one hand, she carried a homemade pumpkin pie that looked slightly uneven around the edges. She smiled with gentle embarrassment. "I made it myself," she admitted. "I am afraid it is not perfect." Daniel accepted it carefully. "Neither are families. That is why we keep making room for one another." Evelyn laughed softly before stepping inside. Owen hurried toward her with unmistakable excitement. "Grandma, come see my science project." Without hesitation, Evelyn followed him into the living room, listening with complete attention as he proudly explained every drawing and experiment. Charlotte quietly watched from the kitchen doorway, tears of gratitude filling her eyes. Daniel slipped one arm gently around her shoulders. "You always believed this day would come," she whispered. Daniel looked toward Evelyn, laughing with Owen. "I believe people can change when someone gives them the chance." Dinner began with simple conversation rather than formal speeches. They talked about school projects, neighborhood snow, favorite recipes, and holiday traditions. Nobody discussed stock prices or business acquisitions. Nobody mentioned the gala. Nobody needed to. Somewhere between passing warm bread and pouring hot cider, the wounds of the past quietly began losing their power. After dinner, Evelyn asked Daniel if they could speak for a moment on the back porch. Snowflakes drifted peacefully beneath the porch light while the neighborhood rested in quiet stillness. Evelyn looked across the backyard before speaking. "I spent my life believing that success meant building an empire strong enough that no one could ever question it." She smiled sadly. "You showed me that the strongest thing anyone can build is a family that still chooses love after disappointment." Daniel rested his hands inside the pockets of his jacket. "Every family has difficult chapters." Evelyn nodded. "Thank you for allowing me to become part of the next one." Daniel extended his hand, but Evelyn gently embraced him instead. There were no photographers waiting outside. No headlines would ever describe the moment. It belonged only to the people who had earned it. As evening settled over the quiet neighborhood, warm light spilled from the windows of the small house, where laughter continued around the dinner table. The old pickup truck still rested in the driveway. Daniel still rose early to open his garage each morning. Evelyn still led one of the nation's largest companies. Yet the greatest change could not be measured in dollars, titles, or influence. It lived inside hearts that had chosen forgiveness over pride, understanding over judgment, and love over appearances. Sometimes the richest person in the room is not the one who owns the tallest building, but the one whose quiet character makes everyone around them become a little kinder. And that kind of wealth never disappears because it is carried not in a bank account, but in the lives forever changed by grace.